was meant by the term abstract art. To abstract something is to draw it out, to extract the essence of it rather than the complete picture. So simply put, it's any image in which the subject matter is not realistic, that is, it's not tonal realism. For instance, the painting by James Whistler of his mother can be called tonal realism, but his later hazy river images were verging on abstraction. What the brain recognizes as a human figure in the foreground is barely a splash of brown paint, while in the background there appear to be some kind of fireworks, but with no identifiable source. So the question is, why did some professional artists begin the journey to just placing shapes and colours on a flat surface, rather as a young child might? Were they just tired of the status quo? Were they looking for change, just for novelty? Or was the reason more significant, more fundamental to the role of artist as observer and interpreter of the world? In the mid-1800s, the role of artist as recorder, from portraits to landscapes to social commentary and beyond, was gradually diminished with the advent of photography and the natural inclination of human beings to create images on a surface goes back to our very beginnings. So what to do when that role is diminished? What evolved out of this identity crisis in the artist's world? A variety of ideas and explorations. Perhaps one could say abstraction began with the Impressionists. They understood that we need little visual information to recognize images, produced mostly landscapes, playing with colour and light, exploring the way we perceive those elements, although long before the Impressionist movement was recognized in France, the English artist J.M.W. Turner was already in the late 1700s attempting to create a response in the viewer to the drama of storms at sea or the noise, smell and dust of a train travelling at high speed, the ultimate of Impressionism perhaps. But Turner's work was highly romantic, nothing to do with the delicate, light-filled landscapes of the French Impressionists, led initially by artists such as Claude Monet. But then the Western world changed in an unprecedented way. World War II. No longer were wars fought with rifles, swords and horses. It was now the industrial age, and battles were waged with machinery, tanks and planes of murder on a mass scale that impacted civilians on an unprecedented scale. We had lost our innocence, and it had a huge impact on everything around us, including the art world. So the art movements of the late 19th and early 20th century came out of ideas about the way in which we interpret the world, not only visually, but emotionally and psychologically as well. However, abstraction wasn't a movement, it was an idea. And out of that idea came many interpretations and a number of manifestos declaring an artist or a group of artists' intent, a definition of new ideas. Interesting that the word manifesto usually refers to political declarations, but in this case it was used to shock or inspire the art world to essentially create a revolution in thinking, in attitudes, in perceptions. Cubism, spearheaded by Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque, whose work is seen here, was probably the most influential of these movements. The Cubists essentially rejected the idea of trying to create the illusion of three-dimensional space and instead acknowledged the nature of the canvas itself as a two-dimensional space. And thus the technique of aerial perspective was essentially left behind. The Futurist movement included artists such as Marcel Duchamp on the left and Umberto Boccioni on the right, whose work seems to reflect Cubism. But the Cubists explored the way in which we record the outside world visually, while the Futurists appeared to be digging into a darker reality. They saw a world of disassociation from our emotions, a godless world of materialism and mind control. The movement caught on in the US with Wyndham Lewis, some of whose work reflects the later work of Duchamp, but other paintings, such as these, his tyro paintings, the meaning of which he expanded from novice to mean a new type of potentially malignant human animal, are distinctly troubling. But then there was Lee Bontessou, with her wonderful futuristic drawings and sculptures like this one. This is a mobile, which acknowledged the flat surface of the canvas by actually using it as a sculpture medium. You can see on the right, she's actually used the canvas to create a wall sculpture. The image on the left is of one of her drawings. And in Australia, where I come from, that influence was also deeply felt, with works such as the deeply intellectual work of Australian artist Helen Maudsley, paradoxical with its very feminine colour palette. The Surrealists were exploring the workings of the inner mind based on the newly developed discipline of psychology through the work of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. We tend to associate Giorgio da Chirico and Salvador Dali with the movement, but American artists such as Roberto Matta were also exploring surrealistic concepts. Those are just a few of the artistic movements with manifestos from that time and the extension of their ideas. Abstraction, that is, abstract expressionism, was a reaction to that intellectual labyrinth, to the soullessness, to feelings and emotions that were severely tested during the course of 2 serious economic depressions and 2 world wars. That hopeful rationalism at the end of the early 20th century had lost its appeal, and artists at this crucial time were facing a crisis of subject matter. The horrors of war, poverty of body and spirit, and potential annihilation had been well and truly recorded, perhaps ultimately, with Picasso's Guernica, painted during the Spanish Civil War, 2 years before the declaration of World War II between the rest of Europe and Germany. What more could be said? So where and how exactly did abstractionism begin? It's a difficult thing to define, and especially since there was such a crossover of styles at the time, and many of these movements were verging on what might be called abstraction. It's generally believed that all of the late 20th to early 21st century art movements began in Europe, but in fact, the abstract movement seems to have begun in Sweden with the work of a little-known woman artist and visionary named Hilma af Klint, who lived from 1862 to 1944. Klint was influenced by leaders of spiritual movements at the time, Madame Blavatsky being one of them, and she considered herself to be in contact with a higher consciousness that spoke to and conveyed messages through her. She envisaged her art as a means to convey transcendent realities using geometric forms, biomorphic shapes, and symbolic motifs. Her series paintings for the temple were marked with an X in her notebooks, which means they were not to be shown publicly until 20 years after her death. Perhaps she knew the world wasn't ready for her yet. She died during World War II. And perhaps she knew the world would be very different in the not too distant future. Her most interesting works are perhaps the altarpieces, 2 of which are seen here. They appear to describe a theosophical view of evolution, ascending from a physical to a spiritual plane, from a higher level of being to the material world. So interestingly, her work had nothing to do with the existential images of pre- and post-war artists in Europe, but were an entirely unique vision coming out of her own life experiences. So one wonders if that might point to some kind of collective intelligence whose presence is only expressed by those who were able to tune into those collective energies, the artists of this world. Who can know if the abstractionism in Europe and America was influenced by Hilma af Klint? They may have seen her work, but No doubt their work also evolved quite naturally from those turn of the century movements, which were becoming increasingly non-objective, more tuned to the inner workings of the mind and the emotions, but had nevertheless lost their appeal. American artist Adolf Gottlieb was quoted as saying, "The situation was so bad that I know I felt free to try anything, no matter how absurd it seemed." It's as though the abstract movement didn't evolve out of a previous movement, but that the art world had in effect hit a brick wall. Now artists were looking within to find meaning on a personal level, to begin to understand the world from within, from an intuitive and personal perspective, unrelated to public perception and expectation. Of course, this new direction wasn't well received by the public at the time, generally. The Bauhaus in Germany was closed by the Nazis as a degenerate institution, after which many artists, such as Paul Klee, left the country in order to continue their practice in a more liberal environment. Wassily Kandinsky, who was regarded as one of the first abstractionists, although his early work was more along the lines of Impressionism, he was forced to leave Germany, having already moved there from Moscow, and ended up in France. Kandinsky's vision was particularly interesting. He too was spiritually influenced by the Theosophist Madame Blavatsky. Theosophical theory postulated that creation is a geometrical progression, beginning with what we call 0 point, and some of Kandinsky's work reflects that idea. He argued that abstraction was a vehicle for expressing the spiritual realm using colour, form, and sound as metaphors for cosmic and inner experience. So there is certainly a spiritual aspect to the work of many of these artists, such as Kazimir Malevich or Piet Mondrian, who were both foundational figures. Many of the artists, Mondrian being one of them, felt that geometric shapes were fundamental to the nature of the universe in some mysterious way, and I also happen to subscribe to that idea, given that there's a demonstrable relationship between geometric shapes and sound vibrations and music. It's quite fascinating. If you're interested to follow that up, you can find a link below to the video Sonic Geometry, the Language of Frequency and Form. Then there are people like Marie Raymond, who was influenced by Rosicrucianism. Georges Chacun was inspired by Rudolf Steiner's work. They believed their paintings could serve a spiritual function, opening the viewer to inner transformation and enlightenment. In America, many artists were moving in the same direction. Mark Rothko's later colour field works do indeed have an interesting effect if you stand close enough to shut out the surroundings. I personally find them quite engaging, but some of his later paintings became very dark. Barnett Newman and others were also seeking a sublime, almost spiritual experience with their colour field paintings. But not all artists were looking for some kind of spiritual motivation. Many works were simply playing with shape and colour. Jackson Pollock, we keep coming back to Jackson Pollock. His work is essentially gestural and dynamic, perhaps with an emotional or psychological aspect to it, but who knows? There's no sense of an underlying philosophy, just a desire to give personal expression to the painting process, which he did with great physical energy and success. The massive work Blue Pole seen here, housed in the National Art Gallery in Canberra, Australia, famously sold for $1.3 million in 1973. That was a bit of a scandal at the time. There are countless numbers of abstract artists in most countries of the world, far too many to mention here. So these are just a few who were significant into that transition. And I've presented them not in a fixed order because there was so much interweaving of ideas and belief systems over the last 100 years. or last, let's say, 80 years. In 1939, there was an exhibition of French and British contemporary art in Melbourne, Australia. Um, it was organised by Sir Keith Murdoch, the father of media baron Rupert Murdoch, and that came with a mixed reception. The director of the National Gallery of Victoria at the time, James MacDonald, dismissed modern art as the work of degenerates and perverts. But the world has changed since then. Abstraction's a wonderful way to open up the joys of putting marks on canvas without technical drawing skills, as I've noticed with my own abstract charcoal drawing workshops. And I will, in fact, do a video in the future on charcoal drawing. I might do a few of them. It's great fun. There's somehow a level of concentration and personal investment that one doesn't see in other classes, perhaps because of the simplicity of the materials. And when one doesn't have to consider which colours to use or how to mix them, when you don't need to fiddle with oils or water and washing brushes, when there's only one element to deal with, then there is less conscious thought about the process. And it becomes a more direct expression of the inner self, of the soul. And it's good for us all to indulge in that. It's part of the life process. The visual arts have never just belonged to the realm of professional artists, but the public learns through them and benefits from their expertise and their swapping of ideas. Creative arts are part of the life process. They're an entry into people's own inner minds and yearnings, a sense of connection to the soul. So watch for more videos on charcoal drawing, and thank you for joining me.